Hello, welcome to Secure the Continent and News Central Television. This is a program where we bring you up to speed with all the security happenings on the African continent. Before we get into today's main topic, let me first bring you the security headlines across Africa. Cameroon separatists say splinter groups are responsible for the abduction of locals. A trial of over 2009 massacre begins in Guinea. 11 killed, more missing after an attack on Burkina Faso. And in East Africa, many dead as Ugandan army helicopter crashes in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Don't go anywhere. I will be right back. Today on Secure the Continent, we will be turning our attention to the role of the United Nations in Africa and its response to security challenges on the continent. We'll look at how United Nations peacekeeping missions in African countries have done in achieving their primary role of bringing stability, especially to countries where civil wars, insurgencies and other forms of conflicts have killed civilians and threatened to destabilize surrounding regions. We have more details for you in this package.
In Africa, foreign military interventions are in the spotlight for failing to end conflicts at the continent's hotspots. Both internal and external political interests are contributing factors. Africa's security situation is of a complex dimension. There are components of ethnicity, religion, culture, politics, a fight over resources, migration, and more that often weave together to create a hydra-headed monster in security. Many of the continent's security problems go beyond the surface, with deep historical roots. Military interventions under the United Nations banner have been deployed to deal with the armed conflicts on the continent. However, despite having superior weapons compared to armed groups scattered across Africa, these UN missions have failed and continue to fail dismally on their mandates. In the north, to the Horn of Africa, Central Africa and West Africa, as well as the Sahara and the Sahel regions, conflicts continue to rage in many parts of the continent. The UN has put itself in an interesting position. UN peacekeeping is a unique global partnership. It brings together the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Secretariat, troop and police contributors, and the host government in a combined effort to maintain international peace and security. But how effective has the UN peacekeeping role been in Africa? Peacekeeping missions in Africa face new challenges every day that they didn't anticipate, like the higher risk of conflict due to climate change. And because of their mandate or the political will of the contributing country, it may be difficult for them to engage armed groups directly. Peacekeeping missions in Africa also have to address the allegations of sexual abuse and exploitation, as well as killings, child abuse, torture, and corruption. Some have said it is time for the UN to leave Africa to solve its problem, while others believe there is still a role for the UN to play. As conflicts continue to cause loss of lives and devastation and leave destruction in their wake, the questions of the UN's part in securing Africa will continue to arise.
I have joining me in Secure the Continent today to discuss the role of the United Nations in peacekeeping missions on the continent. I have Emeritus Professor Mukesh Kapila at the University of Manchester and a former senior United Nations official. He was head of the United Nations mission in Darfur. I also have joining me a little bit later Dr. Oluwole Ojewale. He's an expert in conflicts, organized crime and security and governance in West and Central Africa. Professor Kapila, a warm welcome to you and thanks for joining me on the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, Professor, since 1960, there have been more than 30 United Nations peacekeeping missions across Africa, the most of any region in the world. What makes Africa the ground zero of conflicts in the world? Why? What are the key drivers of violent conflicts in Africa? Is it really because Africans are susceptible to violence? What's your explanation for this?
Well, there isn't any single explanation or a single cause. As I think your package illustrated, there are a range of factors at play. There are economic factors. There is a contested governance. In other words, democracy is still under formation in Africa, and people have not yet come together for that in many, many countries. And then there, of course, there is there is corruption and poor governance and so on. So what we have really is the natural evolution of a continent that is trying to find its way. And along the way, I think the differences are unfortunately more often than not being resolved by violence. But if you look at world history, this is not unusual. I think for much of its history, large parts of Asia were in conflict. And of course, we saw that in Europe, we've seen that in the Americas. So I don't think Africans should think that they're somehow more prone to conflict or somehow they're more violent people. We are at a particular stage in African history. Of course, that doesn't mean that Africans should be complacent. After all, we do live in a modern age. And what Africa has to do is to learn the lessons from other continents, not just repeat the mistakes of others.
Now, Professor Kapila, where are the majority of UN peacekeepers currently deployed, and who oversees their deployment? Who is in charge of saying, look, there's a hotspot here, we need to keep the peace, we are sending blue helmets there? How does it work?
Well, normally a UN peacekeeping force is deployed on the resolution of the Security Council. So the Security Council meets, discusses the problem, and says, okay, we agree that we will send some blue helmets there. Now, of course, that's not happening much nowadays because the UN Security Council is paralyzed. The UN is lucky if it can renew existing mandates without making new ones. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either, because performance of UN peacekeeping in recent years has been really very poor. One of the problems is that the Department of Peacekeeping Operations at the UN then decides on the mandate of the mission, under what component of the UN Charter it operates, whether it's allowed to use force, under what circumstances it can attack or defend, and so on and so forth. And that determines the size of the force. And in the end, of course, the UN doesn't have any soldiers in its pocket. It relies on member states.
National armies.
So it relies on volunteers from all over the world. And they come in all shapes and sizes and trainings and capacities and such like. So you get a mixed bag, and often they're under-resourced and not given adequate support. And that's partially explains their poor performance in many countries around the world.
Now, Professor Kapila, what's the role of the United Nations peacekeepers, and do all these peacekeeping missions have the same mandate, and what are some of the ranges of tasks that a typical peacekeeping operation has?
I think a typical peacekeeping operation in an ideal scenario would come into effect when the protagonists in that particular conflict, they have come to an agreement. In other words, there is a peace to keep. If you don't have a peace to keep, then it is pointless to send in peacekeepers. Of course, depending on the degree of aggression that the peacekeepers are mandated.
So, Professor Kapila, sorry to interrupt you here. How do you keep the peace? Because we've seen there's something called the responsibility to protect. That was what NATO used to intervene in Libya when they see that, people are helpless. We need to do something about it. So how do you keep the peace? Do you go in and say, and stop both sides from fighting, or you go after the bad guys?
Well, if you are NATO, you can go after the bad guys. That's what NATO peacekeeping has been about in Bosnia, in Afghanistan also. But if you are the UN, you don't normally have a mandate to go after the bad guys. You only go in when there is consent for the peacekeepers to operate. And that usually happens when an agreement has been signed among the fighting groups. And they say, okay, we agree to stop fighting, and to make sure we don't get into a fight with each other accidentally, please send in some blue helmets who will then separate the protagonists and help to build confidence between them, solve misunderstandings, any confusion, and otherwise give confidence by monitoring the ceasefire that has come into effect. Unfortunately, what's happening more and more is that in the absence of a peace agreement, the Security Council has been saying, the UN has been saying, well, we've got to do something. Too many people are suffering. Too many people are dying. And why don't we just send in some peacekeepers and let them sink or swim? And unfortunately, the peacekeeping instrument has been misused in recent conflicts. In other words, sending peacekeepers when there is no peace to keep anywhere. And this is a failure of democracy.
Can you give us an example of that, sir?
Sorry?
And can you share an example of that, of a situation where peacekeepers have been sent when there's no peace to be kept?
Well, let us look at the situation of Congo, of DRC over decades, in a way. So there have been cycles of violence there, and peacekeepers have gone. UN peacekeepers have gone into Eastern Congo in different parts, Kivu and so on, and they have managed to bring a temporary cessation of the violence. But sooner or later, groups rise. And the UN peacekeepers are totally underpowered to chase them away. And of course, they don't have the mandate to enforce the peace. So it's very important to look whether the mandate is that of peace enforcement or peacekeeping. So, and that's just one example. Now, in the case of Darfur, on the other hand, at the time soon after I was the UN head there, the joint UN-AU mission had more robust terms of reference. It was able to actually create islands of tranquility in Darfur where the fighters could not get at each other. And it physically separated the government troops and the rebel opposition forces. So a lot depends really on those kinds of things as to whether or not peacekeeping works in practice.
Now, Professor Kapila, United Nations peacekeeping operations are a logistical behemoth. They're quite large and expensive operations. How are they staffed and funded? Because like you said earlier, that the United Nations doesn't really have soldiers of its own, and it depends on, national armies across the world.
So once the Security Council has passed a resolution that we will send peacekeepers somewhere, and very often the discussion around the resolution also says how big the force is going to be and what are its powers and authorities. Then an appeal goes out to the member states of the UN to provide the troops of all sorts, medical, logistics, frontline people, police, which is extremely important, and so on. A budget is set, and this calculation is made in New York, and then the contributions of each of the 190-odd UN member states determines the budget. So, big countries contribute a lot. So if you happen to be the US, you will contribute to maybe a third of the budget. Germany will contribute 10-odd%, Japan, China, and so on. So every nation in the world contributes according to their assessed share of the overall budget. That, by the way, is a good financial arrangement because it means that the peacekeeping has the support of the whole world rather than being dependent on individual donors or private forces. Like, when the British went into Sierra Leone, that was a British peacekeeping force, peace enforcement force that went in. It wasn't a UN force. So that's the way things work. Now, the problem is this. For many countries that supply these contingents, contributing to a UN force is actually money spinning, because the armies of many poor countries are so badly trained, badly financed,
yes,
that they can actually earn a lot of money by sending the troops abroad on peacekeeping. And incidentally, in unstable countries, especially in Africa, it's much better to have your army abroad somewhere, inverted commas, keeping the peace, than to be at home making coups. So the whole instrument of peacekeeping has also been distorted and perverted by member states who profit from it and provide the poorly disciplined troops to it.
Now, you talked about the funding structure. Is this funding specific to missions, or there's a yearly overall budget and then money is dispersed to missions according to their needs?
No, it's according to the mission. I mean, the Central Department of Peacekeeping in New York obviously has its core budget as part of the UN Secretariat, but each mission is different. And some missions can be enormous. In the past, certainly, missions in Sudan, in Congo, which I mentioned earlier, they were costing over $1 billion a year. And these are massively expensive. So budgets and contributions are by mission, and they usually tend to be on an annual basis, and then they get extended with another resolution when the time comes up for the renewal.
Now, Professor Kapila, how important is it to have good relations with the host state in carrying out a genuine peace process and political strategy? And can missions be carried out without the invitation of host states? And to also add to this, as a former senior United Nations official, what would you say is the textbook intervention peacekeeping mission that sets the gold standard for peacekeeping missions?
I think the gold standard is when the host country requests peacekeeping, or at least allows the peacekeeping to take place. Obviously, it's extremely difficult for foreign troops to come in if the country where they're supposed to operate doesn't want them, and the environment is therefore hostile to them. Now, that clearly would be a recipe for disaster. Now, it's possible for the UN under its charter to have a peace enforcement mission and, for example, send in blue helmets to a part of the territory of a country where the government does not have sway, and the government may not want them to come in, but because the government has no control over its territory, UN can go in. But that is extremely not worthwhile doing because then, of course, there is no peace to keep. So the consent of the country is extremely important, as well as, the immunities and protections for the peacekeepers coming in. These are not, we're not sending in peacekeepers, blue helmets, armed to the hilt. If they will have basic weapons, they will have basic protections, they will have basic equipment, but they're not there to fight as such. They're there to actually provide a bit of security assurance, deal with law and order situations, and to separate the protagonists wherever possible. These are not, ace fighting troops, trying to enforce peace in a country. Not usually.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Kapila. I'd like to introduce our second guest in this program. Dr. Oluwole Ojewale joins us from Dakar in Senegal. He's an expert on conflicts, organized crime, and security and governance in Western Central Africa. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Ojewale. Always a pleasure to have you on Secure the Continent.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Dr. Ojewale, in the last 50 years, we've seen over 50 peacekeeping operations on the continent. What's your assessment of these missions and its effectiveness?
Thank you so much once again. To a large extent, I think it has been a mixed feeling in terms of what the effectiveness of the peacekeeping mission has looked like in the past 50 years in Africa. Particularly the experience in the DRC readily comes to mind. And the basic thing that we can say is that if there's any lesson that we have learned over the years, as far as militarization of the conflict in Africa, particularly in West and Central Africa, has taught us, is the fact that the conflicts are not going to go away by militarized approach alone. because you ask yourself the question why the peacekeeping operation has lasted for over 2 decades in the DRC. And the DRC has remained unstable as it was even about that same period of time 2 decades ago. And then when you also look at the experience in the Sahel and the West African countries, it is similar experience that we are having over the years in terms of militarized operation. So another thing that is very, very important is that we have to look at the political economy of peacekeeping operation, that is the gainers and the losers. So it's a pocket of issues that has not produced a much desired solution that that the people desire over time. The lesson I'm going to anchor on this is the fact that we might begin to look at political solutions to some of the crises that we're having in these places. Because they said the definition of insanity is to continue to do the same thing, why not getting a different result? So we have to begin to look at political solution, political negotiations, particularly as with respect to these conflicts in Central Africa, in West Africa, and other parts of Africa. If you look at the trajectory of peacekeeping operation, it appears that it wants to become an everlasting project. And that is the reason why I talk about the gainers and the losers as far as peacekeeping operation is concerned in Africa. But the bottom factor here is the fact that the people who bear the direct burden of conflict, their lives have never been better off or improved upon as a result of a militarized approach that we have seen over the years.
Thank you, Dr. Ojewale. Let me bring in Professor Kapila. Dr. Ojewale mentioned something instructive, and this would lead to my next question. He said, the submissions appear to be there in perpetuity. So what defines the benchmark for success of these United Nations peacekeeping missions? You look at a situation like Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, Liberia. The war ended, and these countries are now democratic. They ended with the intervention of regional economic communities and their intervention, ECOMOG, for the West African case. But other missions like MONUSCO, for example, and Somalia seems to be caught in an endless cycle of conflict. You were the head of mission in Darfur. Would you say it was successful? What's the benchmark for a successful peacekeeping mission, Professor Kapila?
Well, actually, not just in Sudan, Darfur, but I worked with ECOMOG in West Africa as well in my time in the UK government. I think the benchmark of success would be if the peace that came was sustained and there was a transformation in the country with obviously a democratic and legitimate institutions being formed. So, the benchmark is the same that anyone would expect. Unfortunately, as I was saying earlier on, the peacekeeping tool on its own doesn't bring peace. It should be seen as part of a spectrum of interventions. It includes peacemaking, obviously peacekeeping, and peace building. Very often in MONUSCO area and elsewhere, in South Sudan, we have also seen, we may have elements of peacekeeping, but we've had made no progress with peacemaking. And peace building, incidentally, can take a generation.
So can you define peace building and peacemaking? What's the difference?
Well, peacemaking is more of a diplomatic process where external parties may come to use the good offices to get the protagonists to agree that they will cease fighting and find the peaceful solutions to their problems. Now, and that is a primary role of the UN, by the way, or the African Union. That's what it should be. Peacekeeping, we have talked about, when you put boots on the ground, and there is a physical job to provide physical security and to squash down or dampen those who are creating physical insecurity. And peace building are the economic, social, political and institutional development challenges of a country that need to be addressed, including poverty, including the democracy creation in whatever way is most appropriate in the context of a country. It's not just one model from the West imported. It's whatever is appropriate. And all of that has to happen. And all of that actually has to happen simultaneously if you are going to have peacekeepers productively deployed. If this is not going to happen, then it's much better to stick to peacemaking and then see if you can do a bit of peace building and see if peace will emerge somehow from that process. This is not a science, incidentally. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is a theory behind all this that I'm saying, but there are about as many diverse situations as there are countries in the world, and no one formula suits everybody.
True. Thank you, Professor Kapila. Now, Dr. Ojewale, are there early warning systems and mechanisms that warn these experts that a potential conflict is brewing or is about to erupt? Or does the United Nations wait for the house to catch fire before sending in the firemen?
Gbenga, I struggle to hear you, but I know that
yes.
you were talking
so
about...
I'll repeat my question. I said, are there early warning systems and mechanisms that warn these experts at the United Nations that a potential conflict is about to erupt? Or does the United Nations wait for the house to catch fire before sending in the firemen to put out the fire?
Yes, if you look at the protracted nature of violent conflict in some of these countries that we're talking about, you realize that it has become episodic. And what you find is that there are certain indicators that point in the direction that a trigger is about to cause probably a conflict that has assumed a frozen state that is about to now erupt in those contexts. And I'll give you an instance. In some of these countries that we're talking about, any moment they are approaching election, you realize that the negotiation for political power, access to political power, is usually one of those triggers that bring about conflict in episodic dimension, like I said earlier. So you realize that the tensions are usually higher in those contexts as they approach an election. Another thing is also the issue of censor, because it is going to be germane to political outcome and how political offices are going to be shared in some of those contexts. So I could recall that some of these countries want to go into election without knowing the number of people that make up each of these constituencies. So when you have those underpinning factors in place, there is a likelihood that they are going to trigger conflict. And then another thing that is also very, very important, which I think has emerged as early warning in some of these places, is the fact that at the center of conflict in some of these places is also the resource cost. So when you find a situation whereby possibly some people are getting access to certain resources in those contexts. And the country that readily comes to mind in this context is DRC, which has been experiencing protracted conflict over the years. So you get to certain places where there's a need to gain access on the part of the armed group to some of these resources. So when there is a sudden movement, a sudden conversation moving in the direction of those places, I'm giving an example of South Kivu, for instance, where I've been privileged to work. So there's a region called Sabunda area where coltan is present in huge endowment. So you find a situation whereby the armed group begins to congregate around that area. It's one of those early warning mechanisms that shows that there's the competition that is likely to take place in those places might trigger conflict. So that is one of it. And another thing that is also very, very important, which I think I need to underscore, is the cross-border nature of some of these conflicts. So you have the M23, for instance, who has footprint in Burundi, footprint in Rwanda, footprint in Uganda, footprints, they are establishments deeply rooted in the DRC. So if there is a conflict that has been triggered, probably that affects them in Burundi, or any of these armed groups that have multi-presence across these geographical locations. So if there's a conflict across the border, it spills over into neighboring countries where they have presence. This is one of the unique key that is very, very important in terms of looking at the cross-border relation or cross-border factor that happens within this area and that could cause a spillover into neighboring countries. So see, these are some of the early warning indicators that not only the UN peacekeeping operation, useful to only the UN peacekeeping operation, but even for the internal security management in some of these countries, and even for the diplomatic communities that are present in some of these places. And I must also mention that the diplomatic communities are usually vehicles through which intelligence gathering is taking place in some of those countries. And then that feeds into the larger security environment, diplomatic communities, and the regional cooperation or regional bodies that are operating in those places, which also assist the UN operation in the work that they do. So these are some of the indicators that you see in those fragile contexts.
Thank you, Dr. Ojewale. A fine place to go on a break. When we return, we'll be looking at challenges of these United Nations peacekeeping operations in Africa, and also talks of reform and ways to make the operations more effective. Please stay with us. You're watching Secure the Continent on News Central Television. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Secure the Continent and News Central Television. We have been looking at the United Nations security deployment on the African continent. How effective have they been in bringing about peace and keeping peace? And my guests have been Emeritus Professor Mukesh Kapila, and I also have Dr. Oluwole Ojewale joining live from Dakar in Senegal. Now, Professor Kapila, there have been violent protests against peacekeepers in the Democratic Republic of Congo this year that led to the loss of civilian lives, about 12 civilians and 3 members of the peacekeeping contingent. There's also been protests in Mali calling for the departure of blue helmets. A 2014 report by United Nations internal investigators found that the peacekeepers globally only responded to 1 in 5 cases in which civilians were threatened, and they failed to use force in these deadly attacks. Why does it appear that the United Nations peacekeeping forces look helpless while the civilian population is killed?
Well, I think very often this is because the mandate of the peacekeepers is either not clear or they are not mandated to intervene. They may be mandated to protect themselves, they may be mandated to secure the area where they're in, but they're not mandated to actually oppose the people attacking the civilians.
So there's a strict rule of engagement, I believe.
Yes. So it's the rules of engagement. That's one thing. Another reason is that the interpretation of the rules of engagement can vary. So very often the rules of engagement might say that that your job is to protect civilians in some refugee camp, and if someone attacks the refugee camp, then you should protect the camp. but this may not be interpreted as such by the either the force commander of the contingent, or it may not be interpreted like that by the national provider. So, for example, obviously countries who are providing these troops, they want to make sure no harm comes to them. And because I think the headlines back home, if their troops were being killed on the ground, it will be politically sensitive for them. So very often there is a kind of not competition, but there is a tussle between UN command and the command of the individual peacekeeping contingents. And, this is not like a unified army. It's not like NATO, where NATO powers are decided. We all have central command. And it doesn't matter which troops, which nationality of troops there are, you will follow the NATO commander. Unfortunately, this is not the case in when it comes to UN peacekeepers. And UN peacekeeping management is generally very poor and very weak. And this is one of the reasons why, their performance in protection terms is abysmal.
So when the local population rises and protests and set UN properties on fire, it does send a very bad signal that, look, the United Nations is not welcomed here. How can they, what can they do in the interim to redeem their image, or for lack of a better word, to tell the people that, look, we're here for the good, for your good, and we're here to protect you?
Well, I think if you are in the circumstance where the local population is not just doesn't want you, but has turned against you and is actually setting fire and, basically trying to push you out, then you'll be wise to actually get out. Because you can't stay in places where you are not welcome. This is not a conquering force. They are there to help. They're not there to kind of impose their authority. So that's one thing. Now, in terms of trying to prevent these things happening and to have a better quality, more mutually supportive peace operations on the ground, it's extremely important to improve the training of peacekeepers, to improve the management and leadership of peacekeepers, and to ensure that individual member states who are contributing troops don't interfere with the central UN command structures. And also, we need peacekeeping doctrine that is understood by everyone concerned. One of the problems is that when you have troops coming in from many different countries, and they're all operating according to different doctrines, like force posture, like I remember when I was in Bosnia, I could see the way, for example, European troops behaved in as part of the peacekeeping operation in Bosnia, and the way the American troops behaved as part of the peacekeeping operations in Bosnia were miles apart. The Americans were dressed up as spacemen and kept their distance. The Europeans were actually living with and working with the local communities, trying to build confidence with them. So this is where doctrine and posture come in. And I'm afraid we don't have a unified posture and doctrine agreed among UN in the UN peacekeeping system.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. Now, Dr. Ojewale, still on the theme of criticisms of United Nations peacekeeping operations on the continent, United Nations peacekeeping forces have been accused of committing human rights abuses, including pervasive allegations of sexual abuse and exploitation. Most recently, the United Nations withdrew hundreds of Gabonese peacekeepers from the Central African Republic and opened a probe following allegations of sexual abuse of girls. Do you think these abuses are encouraged by the fact that the United Nations peacekeepers have immunity from prosecution in the countries where they are deployed, or is it that there is a lax type of vetting when it comes to receiving troops from different countries that are providing soldiers for this United Nations peacekeeping missions? Where lies the problem?
Wherever there is conflict across the world, there will definitely be human rights infraction. It is just the responsibility of the security operative to keep that at the barest minimum, because, Prof said earlier, you know that there's going to be clash of culture, clash of understanding, and then even in the understanding of the context, it is very, very important that we bear that at the back of our mind. So in every area where peacekeeping operation has gone on in the world, whether it is in the Baltic states, whether it is in Central Africa, West Africa, or any part of the world, the constant denominator is this issue of human rights abuses. But like I said earlier, what is very, very important is that that is kept at the barest minimum. But I must say that the UN itself as a system, in terms of peacekeeping operation department, do have the protocols in place to deal with such erring soldiers who might have contravened the rules of engagement, particularly in conflict setting like that. So whether they are going to be tried in the country where the offense is committed or whether they are going to be tried elsewhere, the UN do have such what I would call internal protocol of dealing with that. And don't forget that even if one becomes so complicit of war crime while engaging in peacekeeping operation, there are international protocols and standards, international laws of armed conflicts that can be used to even try the person, even if they have to take it to Hague in Netherlands. So I think the responsibility of the peacekeeping operation, like I said earlier, is to keep that at the barest minimum. But you cannot rule out the place of or the incident of human rights infraction in peacekeeping operations.
Now, Professor Kapila, when the United Nations was created in 1945, they said never again will the world witness such horrors. But fast forward to just less than 30 years ago in Rwanda in 1994, the world witnessed very horrific scenes in the Rwandan genocide. What lessons have been learned from United Nations peacekeeping operations in the last 30 years on the African continent, and what sort of reforms would you recommend?
I think, for my sins, I was actually in Rwanda in 1994 during the 100 days of killings, and I saw with my own eyes the genocide unfolding. I wish I could say that great lessons have been learned from the repeated acts of genocide that we witnessed in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Srebrenica, in Cambodia, and several other places. I think the lesson we've learned is that usually when genocide is happening, it has never been prevented. So if you look back over the last 30 years, all the genocides or alleged genocides, they've never been actually stopped. People have gone in after the genocide is underway. They've tried to minimize its consequences, but nobody's actually prevented any genocides, to my experience and knowledge, ever since the word was invented in the 1940s. Secondly, I think the nature of the intervention that is required in the case of genocidal conflicts requires such an overwhelming use of force to counter the evil force that no country is actually willing to do it except on their own. And that's why, of course, you had this UN, and where you could pool your forces together and go in collectively. But generally speaking, by the time countries realize that genocide is happening, by the time they summon up the will to do something, by the time the Security Council passes a resolution to do something, by the time then the nation states contribute assets to physical capacities to do something, the job is done. The genocide is done. It's finished. You can shed tears. You can build memorials. You can do your humanitarian relief. You can bury the bodies. You can also do forensic examinations. You can charge the war criminals. And that, by the way, will go on for decades. I mean, even now, genocidaires in Cambodia are still being sentenced down there. So I'm afraid I wish I could give you some answer, which was to say that somehow the experience of the past means that we are better at preventing and responding to these things now. The evidence is the reverse.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. Now, Oluwole, we can't talk about the United Nations in Africa without talking about Africa's solutions to African problems. Now, let's look at AU-led intervention missions and peacekeeping operations on the continent. How effective are they, and what are the challenges faced by African Union, and can they work independently of the United Nations?
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I think in terms of the involvement of the AU in peacekeeping operation in Africa, to a large extent, I would say the involvement of the AU has actually been overshadowed by the UN peacekeeping operation. And don't also forget the fact that what we have seen lately in Africa is what some scholars have regarded as security logjam. So you have a situation whereby the UN peacekeeping operation is going on. And I'm giving an example of the Sahel, for instance, now, maybe in Mali, as an example. At the same time, you have what they call the G5 Sahel. And then at the same time, you also have different countries getting involved in the operation that is going on in the Sahel, whether it is whether it is the France in particular, and then a little bit of ECOWAS involvement in the negotiation as well. So when you look at the cacophony of operational voices in terms of peacekeeping operation that is going on in Africa, it becomes very, very limited in terms of delineating or assessing the effectiveness of AU peacekeeping operation. So I think to the extent to which AU voice has been drawn, we are left with very limited indicators to measure the measurement or effectiveness of the AU operation in Africa. But that is not to underemphasize or to state that AU is not involved in peacekeeping operation in Africa. But I think what is important for me to highlight here is the fact that when your house is on fire, indeed you can invite external actors to help you in quenching the fire. But knowing fully well that you are the one that is going to bear the full consequences of that inferno. The responsibility lies with AU. The responsibility lies with the head of state. The responsibility lies with the regional bodies in Africa to actually put their house in order and ensure that these conflicts going on in the different part of the continent are effectively managed and put under control. So the responsibility now lies with the AU to find our voice in the cacophony of noise going on in the name of peacekeeping operation, or what I mentioned earlier in terms of what the scholars and practitioners have described as security logjam in African conflict settings now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oluwole Ojewale and Professor Mukesh Kapila for being a part of today's program. I do appreciate your insights and contributions to the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now, the rise of partnership peacekeeping has been a positive process overall in terms of political and operational burden sharing. In Africa, in particular, there is evidence that regional engagement contributes to the success of governance. In some conflicts, neither the United Nations nor any other multilateral actor will have the will or means to make or keep the peace. In an era of geopolitical fragmentation, countries, leaders, United Nations peacemakers, peacekeepers and experts on post-conflict recovery will need to walk through a complex and shifting range of institutional channels and partnerships. Thanks for being a part of the program. On behalf of the team and I say a big thank you to you all for watching Secure the Continent. Until next time, I'm Gbenga Aborowa. Bye-bye.